So welcome everybody to our 6th webinar for this year. I've lost my notes, my introduction. So I would like to say a very warm welcome to Elsa Dow, Charlie and Jacqueline Chen, who work in Scotland, and they've kindly agreed to talk to us about the work that they've been doing around the use of stairlifts for individuals with cognitive impairments. The session will last about 90 minutes or so, I think, possibly a bit longer, maybe a bit shorter. If anybody does have any questions, please raise them as we go, either by raising your hand, and if you want to, you can ask the question yourself, or if you'd rather, pop it in the chat, and I will ask the questions as they come. We do have a question from Yosh asking if it's possible to have copies of the slides. Elsa, are you happy with us to share the slides?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Fantastic.
What I can do is I can send it as a PDF format, which obviously it won't take up so much data, and obviously it isn't editable either for copyright and things. So I can email that to you.
Oh, brilliant. Thanks very much. So it's over to Elsa. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David, and hello, and thanks for taking the time to come today. My name's Ailsa Dow, and I'm going to be presenting the first part of this webinar, and then I'll just introduce myself. So I'm a senior practitioner occupational therapist within Fife Council Health and Social Care Partnership, and with me today is Dr. Charlie Chung, who is an occupational therapist and is a PhD stroke specialist and a rehabilitation manager currently with NHS Fife, and also Jackie Chung, head OT with older adult mental health in NHS Fife, and yes, they are married. So an interesting backstory to that one, but that's for another day maybe. It might come up in the questions. So yeah, let's just, and we've put our Twitter handles on there and email contacts as well, if anybody would like to follow us on Twitter, etc. So what we would hope that you would achieve today and learn from today is to be aware of aspects of cognition and executive function in relation to stairlift assessment. We're going to give you an overview of some of the standardised cognitive screening tools that we've been using and how they can inform your assessment and your clinical reasoning. And also to think about any practice examples, ponder on that and think about cases you've even worked with yourself and how your own service could work in partnership with health and social care colleagues to use cognitive screening in your assessment. So just to get started, I thought this was a lovely quotation from Judy Cornish. Now, Judy Cornish is an author and an expert on dementia care, and she has led on this project called the DAWN method. It's a specific way of using a personalised approach for people with dementia, and it just focuses on the beating heart of what our project is all about, and it's about a strengths-based approach and focusing on the person's skills, what they can do, rather than what they cannot do, and to think about that as we're going through this webinar today. And so just briefly, just to give you an introduction of how it all started. So for a long time, Fife Council occupational therapists had been looking at standardised assessment tools across the board, but we had difficulty trying to sort of put them in, implement them into practice. So when we attended an executive function workshop delivered by Charlie, it really gave us a light bulb moment to think, you know, this is something that we really need to be doing, is using standardised cognitive assessments in our assessment toolkit. And very quickly, thankfully, Charlie and colleagues were very willing to give of their time. We formed a working group in 2016 and started it from there, and it's been quite a journey from there, as I'll show you soon. But just to say that this project is not just for people that are diagnosed with dementia, it's for anybody that has a cognitive impairment through whatever condition that they have. And this is just a little picture taken a few years ago of our working group at the time. And it really is truly a partnership approach. We couldn't have achieved what we've achieved without it being a partnership approach, and being able to share skills and experience. And as a background to some of this as well, is in Scotland we have the Connecting Support Connecting People support framework, which it is a framework to help allied health professions improve and deliver on best practice for people living with dementia, and it's in conjunction with Alzheimer's Scotland. Now in the rest of the UK you may have a similar framework driven by your dementia policy through Alzheimer's Society potentially. So we would encourage you could download this document. It's worth a read, and it gives you inspirational experiences of different projects throughout the country and best practice examples. And within this document our project is mentioned, which is lovely as well. And I thought it was a really good quotation, and within this document where it focuses on the fact that the rehabilitation needs, enablement needs of people with dementia, it's not a specialist thing that we should just leave for occupational therapists that specialise in dementia as their field. It's for any occupational therapist. As you know, dementia is rising. We've got a huge amount of people living with dementia, and many more that are not diagnosed. So really dementia is every allied health professional's business. We all need to be taking a part and making sure that we're delivering best services for these people. And this is just, again, just showing you, highlighting the journey that we've made in our project. It's not been a quick journey, and as you know, trying to improve service delivery while also working hard at your day job is very difficult, finding the time to do that. But so it has taken quite a long time, but through that we've had some great achievements and had recognition from the Royal College of OT, and we've developed in-service training workshops for all community OT staff to attend, and we have also attended the Royal College of OT Specialist Section Housing Conference, which was great as well. We produced a short film clip for Alzheimer's Scotland, and also our policy officer, Scottish policy officer Alison Keir, has highlighted our project to the Scottish Government at the dementia, the cross-party group on dementia, which was a real honour actually. And we also had over 1,000 register for our webinar last February, which was overwhelming. Just really showing you the amount of interest and there is out there, and the appetite for doing something like this across the country. And we presented at the OT show in November, which was lovely, and also had our article published in November last year's OT News as well. And today, this is a highlight as well. So that's just to show you the progress we've made, and just some photographs that was me being filmed with an actress to show how we use cognitive screening assessments. And then that was our poster presentations at the Royal College of OT conference and Alzheimer's Scotland conference. And from that, it was interesting to hear feedback from occupational therapists who don't have anything like this and often adopt a blanket policy to assessment, which I'll come to talk about in a little while as well. Again, that was just a picture showing the journal article in the OT News, not the journal, sorry, the OT News article. And also a little picture of my gentleman who was featured. He was my little poster boy in OT News, and he was delighted. He gave his consent. He was delighted to have his picture taken because we used cognitive assessments with this man and enabled him to be able to use the stair lift safely with supervision from his wife. And that was just showing you the presentation that I did at the OT conference in November as well, the OT show, sorry, in November. So you'll all be familiar with this document, which is your professional standards of practice. And in that, in section 4, it emphasises that you must try and use assessment techniques, draw on different assessment tools in your practice, and utilise further assessments if required. So that's in your professional standards. Again, another key document is embracing risk enabling choice, which guides our project, because as we know, it's all about risk enablement, risk management, and also the move away from being adopting risk averse procedures and practices, and we should be trying to embrace risk as much as we can. And this was another interesting booklet that's been designed by people with dementia, for people with dementia, and it's all about your rights as someone with dementia. And in that, interestingly, the document mentioned a specific real example of a gentleman named Raj who was declined an assessment at the stage of referral because he had a diagnosis of dementia and he had been requesting an assessment for stairlift provision, and that was found to be discriminatory. So again, it's just to make you think that as a service, are you adopting a blanket policy of refusing to assess someone at point blank for a stairlift if they've requested one because they have a diagnosis of dementia? We really should be avoiding that practice. And so now I'm going to hand you over to Charlie, who is an expert in executive function and all things to do with cognition. And he's going to really explain to you how understanding executive function and cognition helps to inform stairlift eligibility.
Thanks very much, Ailsa. Thanks for that great introduction. Hi, everybody. Yeah, this section here, we're just going to go through our reasoning behind our choice of tools that we use to assess people's cognition, to inform whether they would be able to use a stairlift or not. But it's not an easy affair. It wasn't just as simple as just thinking what the appropriate tool was. We had to embed a whole approach along with this, which was also involved in the training that we delivered as well. So the question here is, how do we use assessments to inform whether people can operate a stairlift or not? Probably the ideal thing is if we had a stairlift for them to use, and in parts of our region this was available in the past but not so available now. But I have to say, even when it was available, if somebody was able to use a strange stairlift in a strange location and they operated it well and safely, then that was an obvious good indicator for their ongoing ability to use that if one was commissioned. However, if they had problems, then there were still further questions, because were these problems generated because they actually did not have the cognition to operate it, or was it because they didn't have the cognition when faced with a very new situation in a new place? Was there a level of anxiety there? So there are various questions that came in that were difficult to answer, even when we did have a stairlift to assess people on. So how do we do it? Can we observe how they get on with another task? Useful, it can provide clues. But the issue here is that other tasks, for instance, like washing dishes or doing the laundry, tend to be very familiar to people, so might not have the same validity as the actual stairlift use when compared to the skills required for a stairlift. Okay, next slide, please. So we can use standardized screening tools. How do we use these? Is it a passing score? That could be a possibility, but we encounter a challenge here as well, because there's the Montreal Cognitive Assessment that many, if not all of you, will be familiar with, and it's representative of a tool with various different sections that actually look at different parts of someone's cognition. But here comes the issue. Two people can score, say, 18 out of 30, but they may be scoring these points on the success and challenges of different sections of that test, sections which actually relate to different aspects of cognition. And the question is, are all aspects of that test relevant for stairlift operation? The recommendation very much is that we must use validated norm-referenced assessments, but for the specific purpose of application to stairlift, there is no such assessment available. So this is what takes us to the reasoning behind a deeper understanding of cognition. And when Ailsa kindly mentioned about the executive function workshop, the emphasis on that wasn't to consider cognition as just one whole thing. It is considering the cognition in all its component parts and its implications on function, so that when we use tools, we are actually looking at the relevance of the various parts of how somebody scored within that tool. So I'll run through the areas of cognition, and hopefully we can raise an awareness of how this might be done, and you can consider this for your own practice. Okay, thanks, Ailsa. Next slide, please. So let's start with the definition of cognition. Mental functions which help us to acquire, organise, manipulate and use information and knowledge. That's a pretty good definition of cognition overall. But then we need to start breaking it down, because any existing research is supporting the fact that just working on cognition probably isn't effective. We need to work on the specifics of cognition for greater effect to be had. I suppose similar way to, we don't consider just movement in one big mass. We will consider how somebody's arm moves, their shoulder moves, how they grip, how they release. We need that kind of detail, and it's similar with cognition. And next slide, please. This is just a starting model, and this is illustrating how information comes into our system through our sensory inputs, through our perceptual analysis. But then the bit that we want to concentrate on are three main components: tension, our memory systems, in particular working memory, which are short-term memory systems, our long-term memory systems, but most importantly, how they don't exist independently from our executive function systems, which are our organizing, problem-solving processes in order to create that output. They are all connected up, and particularly executive function, when our function is deliberate, then executive function is a controlling mechanism of attention, of our memory systems. Okay, next slide, please, Ilsa. So let's look at attention first of all, and I'll give examples of some of these just to describe the different types of attention. First of all, we have focused attention, and when you hear a sound or catch something out of the corner of your eye, or see something suddenly appear, and we turn our head, we become alert to that stimulus, that is focused attention, nothing more. Very quick, very rapid directing of our attention to a stimulus. Sustained attention is our ability to maintain that attention over time, often called vigilance, where a good example of this is waiting for the kettle to boil. We have to keep our attention there despite there being no stimulation, and react when the stimulus finally comes in the kettle clicking off, or if you're using retro equipment, when the whistle goes on the kettle on the gas stove. Then we have selective attention, and you'll note on that slide that there are different areas of the brain that are mentioned there: the anterior thalamus for sustained attention, the right temporal parietal complex. And this is where you may have had experience of that complex, because people who have had damage to the brain, particularly in the right hemisphere where the right temporal parietal complex is, can perhaps lose the ability to selectively attend. And selectively attending to something is like having a torch beam. And we don't attend to everything in one go with everything that we see in front of us. Instead, we swing a torch beam around to rest on those aspects that are most important to us, which is why when we're attending to things in a very deliberate way, we can actually lose our attention on the things that are maybe in the periphery. And those people that have had damage to the right hemisphere can actually lose their ability to control this torch beam and direct their attention onto a stimulus. Then we have divided attention. And divided attention is our ability to attend to more than one thing at once. Executive control is required here, because usually one of these things is more conscious than the other thing, and we operate our attention at different levels: a very deliberate conscious level and a routine level. So for instance, somebody who has just learned to use a walking frame for the first time, for instance, usually walking is more automatic, and somebody can divide their attention between walking and conversing. But if you've ever been with somebody, maybe they're in a physiotherapy session, and you start talking to them while they're coming to grips with this walking frame, you can find that quite easily they can actually lose their balance and tip over, because they don't have the ability to divide their attention between talking and the use of this new walking frame. But as the new walking frame becomes more routine in its execution, then they probably can develop the ability to converse and walk at the same time. So also overt and covert attention, and it's something to be aware of, particularly when you're working with people who can't move easily, don't have the postural stability. Our heads are designed to face the stimulus which we're attending to. That's when our optimum attention happens. But if somebody can't move, if they can't move their trunk, if they can't move their head, then they must rely on covert attention. So covert attention is the ability to turn our attention to something without necessarily looking or facing it, and such as trying to eavesdrop in a room where you don't want to face somebody, but you're actually listening into something that's going on behind you. You're actually using your covert attention in that situation. So it's an added consideration for when people can't use their overt attention, that perhaps we need to meet that challenge through adaptations, for instance, or changing the environment. So you can see there's various considerations there. And next slide, please, Elsa. And so some of the key things that you might find with Stairlift are somebody being given instructions, but they can't sustain their attention and they're distracted with everything they see around them. They have difficulty locating the controls. That could be a sensory orienting system, which is related to the right hemisphere of the brain. They can't swing the torch beam in a deliberate way towards the controls. Or they have difficulty keeping attention on operating the stairlift and transferring on and off when other people are in the house interacting with them. If they have limited divided attention, they may have issues with that ability. So you can see how the different components of attention relate very strongly to stairlift use. And again, that is a very broad and basic level of thinking about it. Okay, next slide, please, Elsa. So now thinking about memory, and again, like attention, memory isn't just one thing. We have a series of different memories that are different functions within different aspects of our brain. So the first division here is simply to think of short-term and long-term memory, which I don't think any of us will be a stranger to, because that's the way, right from the first stages of memory that we're taught to think about memory. But then let's go a step further and look at long-term memory. You can see a subdivision there into non-declarative memory and declarative memory. So non-declarative memory is our routine memory, is our procedure, or the riding the bike type of memory. And it's actually processed and built in a different location of the brain called the corpus striatum than declarative memory, which is our conscious, deliberate memory. So the declarative memory is dependent on the hippocampus in our brain, which is between parietal and temporal lobes. And often when people have damage to the middle part of the brain, the hippocampi can be damaged. And as a result, people can operate in the here and now using their short-term memory, but they have no new learning. They cannot form new memories. But sometimes people are left with some residual ability, even though it takes more effort to learn new things. We need to get the conditions right in terms of the level of the information, the speed of the information, how meaningful the information is. And what's been shown is something that is being processed in declarative memory can then become a non-declarative memory through practice. Just think about when you started to learn to drive, for instance, or any other task which required a lot of concentration to start with. You're using very much your conscious, deliberate, declarative memory. But after a few years of driving, you can arrive at your work and actually forget how you got there, because you've been driving in automatic mode and you've been driving in that bicycle type mode, the non-declarative memory. Short-term memory and the working memory is a different process and involves both hemispheres and can be thought of as the bridge between memory and executive function, where we hold on to information short-term so that we can make use of it. And then once we've made use of it, we can let it go, which gives us capacity for more information going in. You could probably equate it, for those of you who are computer buffs and know random access memory, RAM, and how much RAM there is. It's our brain's equivalent of RAM, that we need the space to be able to bring information in, combine it with long-term memories, combine it with sensations, and use our executive function to make decisions around that information that's coming in. So to give you an example of that is, if I was to ask you to add a couple of digits together, say 9 and 6, you get the answer 15. So that's not a problem. You're not really using much working memory there. But if I was then to ask you to add together 359 and 487, now that's a different deal, isn't it? And what you might start to do is think, okay, the first number ended in 9, this number ends in 7, so I'm visualizing the 6 and I'm carrying over the 1, but by then you've forgotten what the rest of the numbers are. I've forgotten what the rest of the numbers are, so we've not held on to that. But what you've been doing is using working memory. And some of the classic tests of working memory include the serial 7s, which is in the Montreal Cognitive Assessment, amongst others. From 100, take away 7, keep on taking away 7 until I ask you to stop. And what that does is the person has to hold each total in their mind, because you're not telling them the total, and then perform the calculation on the totals that they're holding on in their mind at each step. And that's a test of working memory. Another real life example is when perhaps you played in the game I went to the shop and bought a loaf of bread. When you were younger, you know, either at school or in Scouts or Guides, and it was the game where people sat in a row or in a circle, and the first person would say, I went to the shop and bought a pint of milk. Then the next person would say, I went to the shop and bought a loaf of bread and a pint of milk. So what each person is having to do is hold in their memory, the short-term memory, what people have said before them, and then come up with their own answer as well. And working memory as one of the short-term memory functions is probably one of the most important concepts related to function and learning new things and applying new things, you know, to recognize. And it's something that has implications, you know, when we go on to the next slide. Thanks, Ailsa. So just before going back to the implications, this is a process of memory model which describes and shows how memory is formed. So first of all, we'll have attention, and it's attention that brings information into our system. Now, the information may come in, but we have to understand it in the encoding stage for it to be stored. If for instance, somebody talks to us in a language we don't understand, then we can have the best attention in the world, but if we don't understand it, we're not going to store it. Then it's stored, but onto working memories in short-term memory until it's consolidated. And consolidation is the process by which somebody tells you their name, you might relate it to somebody that you know, or you might repeat it a few times to make sure that you get that information in there. But if you're like me, if I don't do that immediately, I just forget people's names right away. So it doesn't stay stored, it's gone from my working memory. So I'm always conscious to really consolidate when information comes to me. And then recall is the final stage of actually our neurons have connected up so much through consolidation that recall becomes possible and easier at that stage. But when you look at this process, it's a good exercise to think about when we work with people in everyday life, our clients, our patients, even our colleagues. How much opportunity are we giving people, first of all, to turn their attention onto something, to encode, you know, is the speed in which we're delivering the information or the complexity or the volume of information appropriate for that person to understand what's happening? And are we giving people the chance to consolidate, to run through the information? Are we giving the information in other formats, for instance, visual or written formats, in addition to just expecting them to recall verbal information? Okay, next slide, please. So some of the implications here are overloading of working memory. You know, we're talking too much, we're telling somebody too much information, and they just can't take on board that amount of information. Another situation is that they've actually learned what they are to do. They can actually tell you the procedure of what they're about to do, but when they start to do it, sometimes what can happen is that process of, or their need to process that information, as well as bring back the memory of the procedure, is tipped them over the edge for their working memory and overloaded them through doing simultaneous performance as well as recalling the steps. and are instructions given in a format which the person finds challenging. So some people are visual learners, some people are verbal learners. Some people actually have it forced upon them. So for instance, if somebody's had a stroke in the left hemisphere, even if their ability for speech is not affected, their ability to retain semantic information, that is, the semantic memory of language and facts, can be severely affected so that they don't hold on to what's been verbalized and need information in a different format. Okay, next slide, please, Elsa. And it brings us to executive function. And like attention and memory, this isn't just one thing. This is probably one of the best definitions, but just so that you're aware, there is no one definition of executive function. But they do have a commonality in terms of referring to a set of skills or processes. So not one thing, there's various processes. It does include problem solving, planning, organization, self-monitoring, initiation, error correction, behavioural regulation. Some other lists have different parts in them. But as part of my research from a few years ago, I went through the process of trying to distill down executive function into its basic building blocks in order that we could analyse them in a Cochrane review. So what I mean by that is, if you look at initiation, probably a kind of one or two stage understanding type of action, whereas problem solving is huge, isn't it? That involves a lot of stages, a lot of steps from understanding, includes planning, it includes initiation. So what are the basic building blocks of these components of executive function? Okay, next slide, please. Executive function isn't required all the time. When you've driven to your work and you've forgotten how you've gotten there, you probably didn't really need to exercise much executive function. You were operating routinely. But if something's novel, like often a stairlift is, if it's complex, we can argue that actually there's only a few controls, but for somebody with cognitive challenges, then that can be complex. Or it can be difficult, again, is the degree to which the person's level of cognition is being applied to the stairlift use. Dangerous. Now this is an interesting one because this doesn't necessarily represent a real danger. If you think about situations where you're having to do a presentation like this, or being asked to sing in front of a group of people, you may experience an anxiety response. Although there's no physical danger coming to you, you may still perceive that danger. And your cognitive processes, your executive function is really required at that stage. An example of that is, if you can imagine yourself walking along a path which is 3 feet wide and it's straight, it's level, you're not really having to use much executive function. But imagine these same dimensions, but you're actually walking on a 3-foot wall with a 30-foot drop on either side. That creates a different form of processing, doesn't it? You're probably having to be a lot more careful, a lot more deliberate, a lot more strategies compared to just being on a level path where you can walk. But physically, it's exactly the same actions, but your cognition has had to change because of the demands on it. And things that require error correction. Okay, thanks, Elsa. Next slide, please. So here are the 5 components. I'll go through these briefly. We've got these on different slides. We have concept formation, basic understanding, planning, the steps towards doing something, initiating, getting started, inhibition, stopping things that aren't effective anymore or inappropriate, inflexibility, the ability to move between different stages of a task or switch between different actions. Okay, next slide, please. So a little bit more detail on these. Concept formation is about being able to understand, but involves generalizing situations, applying principles, accounting for past, future, or out of sight situations. So for instance, predicting, what do you need a raincoat or not for the weather, which lies at lunchtime when you're at 9 o'clock in the morning. So everything centers around understanding. If somebody doesn't have understanding of a situation, then it's very difficult to employ executive function. And next slide, please. And this is planning, having the concept of the problem. So somebody needs to be able to understand to plan, selecting goals, maybe deciding not to take immediate action, but to analyse the problem to determine what's required to solve it. So not acting routinely, it's actually being very deliberate in what plan is being put in place, and actually choosing a strategy to undertake the plan. Okay, next slide, please. Now, initiation is not related to somebody's emotion towards their motivation or their interest or not. This is initiation related to the balance between two areas of the brain, the cingulum, which is related to our activation, and supplementary motor area, which is supported, which supports our inhibition. Our brains and our bodies operate in balance between activity and dampening, so that we can do smooth movements, so that we don't overthink things, so we don't exaggerate things. So when there is that imbalance from damage to the brain, somebody can have full interest in doing something, they can be motivated towards doing something, but without a cue, they experience difficulty in just getting things started. And sometimes we've seen people with that problem, but not realizing there was a problem in a hospital setting. They've gone home and it was reckoned that they didn't need any care or in the morning, and they've not undertaken any self-care by the time lunch or tea time comes along. And it may have been because they were never given the chance to have their initiation assessed, because in a hospital there's always something cueing them into action. Okay, next slide, please. And inhibition, the ability to discontinue a particular function. That's Ailsa fired through there. Okay, I think it's 2 slides back. Yeah, the one, but that's brilliant. Thanks, Ailsa. I admire your control of these slides. Yeah, so inhibition, a good example of inhibition is when you're doing something, and have you ever moved house, for instance, and just routinely driven back to your old house without thinking about it? That's a prepotent response, and we'll tend to act on prepotent responses if our executive function does not override them. You've come home filling the fridge with your groceries, you answer your mobile phone, and then when you click off the phone, you put the phone in the fridge. Now, I don't know if anybody's done that, but again, a prepotent action. So when people are used to doing things a certain way, so for instance, they're used to trying to walk up the stairs, and they have to inhibit that response to use the stair lift. And it's one of many examples of where inhibition can be challenging for people if they don't have control of that. And next slide, please. And flexibility, the ability to move deliberately between actions or ideas. We can have reactive flexibility, and that's the flexibility where somebody can respond to certain things, but only if they're cued into doing it. And the flexibility required for stairlift use, very much that deliberate, spontaneous flexibility. Okay, thanks, Ailsa. And next slide. So the implications there are difficulty planning, retrieving items, managing walking aids. So when the stair lift is combined with the necessity of undertaking other actions. I once worked with a gentleman who the process of the straight stair lift was reasonably straightforward for him, but the difficulty was in approaching the stair lift because he was still a little bit unsteady with a walking frame, and the foot plate that flipped down on the stair lift actually came out quite far, so that he couldn't get right up to the stair lift and had to undertake this arc of movement and get down onto the stair lift from one side. So it added to his need to use executive function in that situation, an executive function which was impaired. So it did make it difficult for him. Difficulty initiating, we've spoken about that. It's one thing to have it there, but if somebody's got an initiation problem and bathrooms upstairs or going to bed at night is upstairs, then actually they may not actually even use the stair lift to go upstairs because they've not initiated. Difficulty inhibiting prepotent behaviours indicate this one, that somebody may just see the stairs and just go and try and walk up the stairs and not actually try to use the stair lift. And then difficulty problem solving. If the stair lift, something happens with the stair lift, like it suddenly stops, or if their hand hasn't maintained the pressure on the control, various things that can happen. And people with executive function difficulty can have difficulty responding to these certain situations. Okay, next slide, please. So just going to pause here. The little summary for this bit is we've seen how cognition is multi component, how executive function is key. So really, when we're using our assessment tools, we are looking for executive function because it tends to be the hidden aspect of cognition. We can often observe somebody's attention and observe somebody's memory for instructions, but when it comes to all the problem solving, organizing, planning, coordinating bits, and that can be really quite difficult. So as we go on with this presentation, we'll be talking about how, and Ailsa will take a bit, which is all about how we use the profile of an assessment tool rather than the score only. So we're just going to pause here just for a few seconds to see if anybody has any questions, because we're always aware that that's a lot of information to be hit with in one go.
Does anybody have any questions? We did have a very kind comment from Yosh saying this is the most helpful presentation I think I've ever seen.
Oh,
I did notice that. Thank you very much. That's one of the best comments I think we've had for a while. So that's made my week.
Sorry, we've got Zlativ has a question. Do you want your well, I'll unmute you, and then if you want to ask it and if you want to start your video, that's entirely up to you.
Hello.
Hi, Zlativ.
Hello, it's inside. I've just got a quick question. Do you know when you said about inhibiting proposant behaviour,
Yes.
for example, sort of like trying to get somebody to stop using the stairs but use the stair lift?
Yeah.
What techniques could you use to sort of like break that cycle?
One of the main techniques is the purpose behind it is bringing somebody out of routine behaviour into conscious, deliberate behaviour. So an internal strategy is for the education to let them understand what you're actually trying to do, because these can be kind of weird and wonderful methods, but is to when you know, the type of instruction I give to somebody is whenever you're doing something moving, be very conscious about what you're doing. You know, actually think through the steps of what you're doing rather than just go ahead and do it, in which case the wrong program, if you like, is selected. But then we're not there all the time to give people that instruction. And another alternative, an external strategy, can be the use of like an audio cue, like even like a ping or a ting, you know, with various timers, etc., or something that just goes off periodically that somebody can be cued into starting, you know, to cue them, or somebody else starts it, particularly as it's challenging to use these at pre-timed parts of the day. So really, I most often go down the line of be very deliberate about what you're doing.
And it may well be as well, in addition to that, is it might be the usual visual aids as well, that the person can see a visual cue not to use the stairs, or as Charlie said, it could be some sort of memo minder or some sort of motion detector that when the person's approaching the stairs, that they are reminded not to use the stairs. Now that might not be effective for some people. It might make the person more confused, but it's just some tips and hints that may or may not work.
Yeah, it's a good point. It's a very individual thing.
I've had sort of like relative sort of success with using signage at the bottom and top of the stairs, but with other people, it just doesn't register. So people just completely ignore that and they don't even see the signs. So it's almost like a lot of time you use like repetition. You'd kind of like take them through the process at the bottom and the top of the stairs and get them used to that. But I was just wondering if there was any other techniques that you're aware of that might break that sort of like cycle.
And it could be that the level of inhibition is to the degree that the person's probably not going to be independent with the stair lift. They may manage it, but with caregiver assistance, and that might be your plan, you know.
Yeah.
But certainly anything that creates practice, again, when you think about that model of memory from declarative to non-declarative, that's pretty much what's happening with the practice of that you're actually turning something into routine behaviour.
I think as well, going forward with the, we'll be showing some of the assessments we use, and you know, obviously some of these assessments define that capacity for that person. Might not be for all, but it certainly helps support something that why a person's struggling with visual cues and things like that. So we'll go on to talk about that as well.
Yeah. That's a great question, though. Thank you very much for that.
Thank you. So,
does anybody else have any more questions?
Okay, shall we
As a
carry
note.
on?
We'll just carry on now then. That's great. We'll go to the next slide. Just get my cursor to click on it. That's it. So again, just to recap, it's not to at all demean as occupational therapists what you're already trying to achieve. When you're assessing someone with a stair lift that has a cognitive impairment, you're already drawing on all your skills and your experience, your holistic assessment, your person-centred approach. You're observing them in their daily activities to try and give you, as Charlie said before, to give you clues and cues as to how the person might manage with a stair lift. You also need to determine, will there be someone consistently around to supervise them using a stair lift? What support is available? Would the person be able to follow that person's instruction as well at the same time? And as Charlie referred to before, sometimes we have the benefit of having a demonstration stair lift available that we can take the service user to, but that's not always practical or easy to do. And it's also crucially not in their home setting either. So it's not going to give a really true picture of how they might cope with a stair lift. But certainly in your local area, if you do have a stair lift, you can take them to. That will certainly help to inform your assessment. Also, we need to draw on the information that we get from our professional supports. So from the general practitioner, the dementia nurse practitioners, your mental health occupational therapists, any other professional that knows the person quite well. What previous assessments have been carried out with that person? Has there been previous standardised screening tools done? What are those results? What are they saying about the person, and are they current and relevant? And all of these help you to draw on your assessment. But crucially, you know, a lot of occupational therapists feel that they need something more standardised, something a bit more concrete to help inform their decision making. And that's where these tools can be very valuable. But also, just again, are we evading or avoiding going down that route of the full assessment by at referral stage, you know, saying, oh, sorry, we wouldn't assess you for a stair lift because you have dementia? Well, that wouldn't be wise. We certainly wouldn't advocate that. Could we take the opposite measure of just biting the bullet and installing a stair lift on a feel and a wing and a prayer that hopefully it will work and they'll be safe with it? Again, that could be quite a risky situation to get into. So we want to try and get something in between those two as well. And again, this is just kind of encapsulating what are the benefits of using cognitive screening tools. It really does help you as an occupational therapist to inform your clinical reasoning. It also helps you to justify if you feel that a stair lift is not suitable for someone. It helps to explain that to family members who might be disputing, why have you refused a stair lift from my mother? She needs one and they're demanding it. So that this gives you an evidence base of why you're declining as well. And also just it helps us to appreciate more, as Charlie was saying, to really understand the elements of cognition and executive function to help us assess that person as more fully if we can as well. And also, as a sideline to doing these cognitive screening tools, we may be one of the first professionals involved with that person. We may detect early cognitive changes, and through our assessment, we might be able to refer that person with their consent for further investigation. And as we know, the earlier the diagnosis, the earlier in that journey that this is picked up, the better for the person so that they can get more help and support. So again, just as I touched on again about activity analysis and just kind of following on from what Charlie was explaining as well, just about all the different elements of cognition, attention, memory, executive function and visual spatial awareness, all of those elements go together in terms of the assessment of someone for a stair lift. And then added into that, you also have the complexity of the style and design of stairs. So in the top picture there, you have quite a tight spiral stair, which visually, spatially for someone could be quite disorientating for them. You've also got down the bottom, you've got a hinged arm that we often have to install. That adds another element of complexity to the stairlift operation and their ability to use the remote control and be aware to send the seat up to the parking point, etc. And all other different types of stairlifts now that we have. And some of the newer models are a little bit less conventional in the way that the arms move back in and out, and the little paddles on the armrests and things like that you have to use, which can add to complexity as well. And this was my little funny additional slide I thought I'd put in. Since it was a platinum jubilee, I just thought, well, you know, Queen may at some point need a stair lift. So, you know, again, will she manage with all the visual spatial elements going on in this stair? Hopefully she will, but she might need an occupational therapist at some point to assess that. So how did we come up with the standardised tools that we're going to be showing you today? How did we just think these up out of our heads? Well, of course not, we didn't. We did a literature search. We tried to find if there was any connection between the use of standardised assessment tools and stairlift use, and we found there wasn't a link there. Plenty of research on standardised assessments, some research on stairlifts, but nothing putting them together. And we did contact, you know, we tried to put the word out across the UK of any other local authority services that were already using this approach, because why reinvent the wheel? But there was nothing. It felt a very new, groundbreaking project. It was very exciting to embark on this journey, and you know, it's been great. So that's kind of how we came to our selection. We did a thorough search. So introducing the MOCA, the Montreal Cognitive Assessment, that was one of our initial assessment tools that we had selected, and as Charlie referred to there, it helps to give the person's cognitive profile. It deals with various different cognitive functions there, and a lot of your services may still be using these in health. You'll be fairly familiar with the MOCA. And then that's just an overview of the MOCA. Basically its background from 1996 there. It's a very quick and easy tool to administer in someone's home setting, which was an important aspect for us to select a tool. And it's provided with instructions and a script, and it was previously free to use and download, but recently the developer has introduced a certification training module that you can do online, but it is at a cost. So for Fife Health and Social Care, we have moved through to another tool because of that, sadly. But that's not to say that you should not use the MOCA in your service. It is still a great tool. But we've now moved to consider the ACE, the Adam Brooks Cognitive Examination. So you may well again be familiar with the ACE. Now the full ACE is quite big. There's a total score of 100 with 21 questions, and not all of the sections relate to the cognitive domains required for a stair lift. So we were trying to look for another tool that was a bit more condensed, but met our needs. So we did find the shorter version, which is the mini ACE. And this was brought out in 2014, and again discovered quite a lot of different areas of cognitive executive function there, and working memory, as Charlie mentioned, is quite a key skill that we like to assess as well. So we've selected the mini ACE, and that's where Fife is using that. Fife Health and Social Care Partnership is using this tool. The great thing with the mini ACE, again, it's a relatively short, quick, easy tool to administer, can be used in the person's home, and it is a widely used tool as much as the MOCA. It's also again validated and standardized as well, and again you're provided with instructions and a script as well. And there is also really useful training guides out there that are free. The New Zealand Dementia website, NZ Dementia, has a brilliant website that you can look at that's got lots of instructional videos and also how you can interpret the scores, etc. It's a really good website, that. So while we were doing the literature search, looking at these tools, what wasn't coming up in the literature search was another tool that was widely used. It's a standardised tool, widely used across occupational therapy in various countries. And this was the Allen Cognitive Level Screen. And because it is a tool that has been used in Fife for many years, we had to look at this tool. We couldn't ignore it. We needed to look at this tool. So what I'm going to do now is hand you over to Jackie, who is very experienced in this tool, and will go on to explain it a lot further for us. So thank you, Jackie.
Okay, thanks, Ailsa. Obviously this picture is just showing you what the lacing tool is. This is the ACLS is tied in with the Claudia Allen, and the lacing element is the L, and the 5 is to do with the 5th version, which is the most up-to-date version. We actually implement it with instructions from a book, and that's why we've got that there for you as well. And the person takes notes throughout, because we're really going with observations of how a person manages to carry out the 3 different stitches that are implemented. Okay, next slide, please. So a wee bit about the Allen Cognitive Level screen. It's very much a profession-specific tool, which is great. It's tied in very much with function, which is fantastic for ourselves. And it helps guide us functionally and cleverly in a standardized way to show how a person is presenting at a certain score. As I say, it's standardized, it's validated. It's quite an old tool. It has also got other elements to it. There's not just the lacing tool, but there can be other parts that can be carried out, such as making a placemat, or there's various things that were used a way back by Claudia Allen herself and our team, where people would implement using a telephone to order things through the haberdashery. They would use money, they would put on coats and belts. It was really quite a big package of assessment, and to be honest, it wasn't really something that we felt we wanted to do over here in Scotland, because it didn't really carry over to be totally valid, and also it was very heavy duty. So we do just tend to go with that actual lacing tool as a baseline screen, and then from that we add our other assessments and observations. What's good about it is it's unique and non-paper based. You don't have, the person doesn't have to rely on writing anything. There's specific scores that tie with the practical performance function, and that goes from 3 to 5.8 in quite detail, 3, 3.2, 3.4, 3.6, right up to 5.8 being the highest score. And it suggests ability for new learning and ability to use new equipment and technology, and that also has a marker. So what we find is that people usually, when they're certainly around the 4.6, 4.8 marker, certainly 5, these people are very much going to be able to take on new learning, or they should be able to take on new learning. Anyone below a certain score, that's when, as Charlie's been noting, a lot of different patterns of behaviour will maybe be coming in to play, like acting on old habits and rituals and procedural habits that we might have, or they might be cognitively overloaded, and that shows up as well in the assessment. It's also an appropriate and practical tool to administer at home. We have to have it that we're set so that we sit to the person's left. We have to follow the rules of the book in order to be standardized. That can be quite tricky when you're actually trying to, you're visually showing someone the assessment and you're also verbally instructing them. So for the OT herself or himself, it is quite tricky, but eventually once you get used to that, the person's got the benefit of having not only a verbal instruction, but a visual instruction. Next slide, please. So this is the Lackos here with the 3 stitches. It originated in the late 60s, so it's an old tool by Claudia Allen herself. It's a standardized screen, as we've said before, and there's a scale that's the 3 point upwards to 5.8. It's a visual motor task to provide an estimate of a person's ability to learn to do other visual motor tasks, and a screen that provides a quick estimate of a person's current capacity to learn. So basically we go through the 3 different stitches. Where that person then struggles and comes to an end, and it's clear that they're no longer able to embed the information and actually do the assessment correctly, that's where we take our score. Now, the level 5, sorry, is that we actually encourage the person to carry on should they want to the very end, but we have to take a note of the fact that if they struggled in the first stitch, they may want to go to the third stitch, but we're scoring from the first stitch as to where they had the problem. Now, these markers are also cross-referred, and this is where the science came in from Claudia Allen, whereby they did their assessments and their research to show that certain scores cross-relate and correlate to certain functional presentations. So that's where we have our standardization, and that's where it's matched to OT, which is great. So even though we're looking at a simple lacing tool, which is non-threatening to a patient, it's a very useful tool for us to be able to cross-refer to functional presentations, depending on the score they come away with. And also, as a team of, the working group we've got, and Charlie's experience here, we've been able to put markers into what each stitch also conveys as far as new learning, working abilities, working memory, ability to sustain attention, divide attention, inhibit, etc. Next slide, please. Okay, so it's still continue to say here with the OT ourselves in the mental health service, we've actually been using it, I think since 2002. We had a working group going then, and we continue to use it now. We very much validate it. We use AMPs and other assessments as well. Use the ACE3, we use all these assessments, but for ourselves, the LACOS is very good in that it's functional, it's user-friendly, and we just find that other professions as well also have a positive opinion about it. And most importantly, the patients as a rule don't feel threatened by it. So it's a very useful tool, we find. Next slide, please. So as I've said, the tool consists of 3 different stitches, and I'll go on to talk a wee bit about them. You have to follow the script, and the book comes with the actual tool as a package, and you have to be aware of the environment and seating. As I said, you have to sit to that person's left, and you have to administer as a right-handed person. And this is just, I think, to allow that standardization of the person seeing what you're doing with the stitching. So it's a bit difficult for left-handed people. It doesn't matter for the actual patient if he or she is left-handed. It's more just for the actual administrator to implement it as a right-handed person. So the current cost at the moment for the actual tool and for the manual is around £120, which isn't really too bad. And it's something that we find that we're able to train each other up in within our service, as we've been doing with Ailsa's team over the past few years, because it is something that by doing and by discussing and using, it becomes that bit easier. It's just something you have to just do and share a lot, and discuss a lot with your team and your colleagues in order to really get a sense of how to use it. So this is just showing you the actual manual, and this is a wee layout of how the actual manual looks. There's the run and stitch there, and it's showing you the task and pretty much going through all the procedure of it. The actual stitches you see on the actual picture there, the photograph there, we have the running stitch, which is very clear, and that's actually with an actual shoelace, which simplifies and adds to the simplification of actually doing the stitch. Whereas the other 2 stitches, they actually use leather lacing, which adds to the difficulty of doing a stitch. If we were just using normal thread that was quite thick, or just using the shoelace, then it would continue to be quite easy for the person. We want to add in little elements that make it difficult, so the person has to have some sort of strategy and sorting out what is wrong with it and how to fix it and how to attend to it and keep their attention sustained in fixing it. So that's why I think LACOS has got the lacing element to it there. Okay, so we've got the first one is the running stitch, and that's the one, as I said, that's got the actual shoelace that gets used. And what you're doing is you're asking the person to complete 3 correct running stitches in consecutive holes. And you get them first of all to note that they can see the holes. That's obviously very important. Make sure their lighting's right. Make sure they've got their glasses, you know, so that all these things are cancelled off as being something that could affect what they're doing. You're allowed to give a demonstration verbally and obviously physically. And then it's up to them to try and implement it. They might struggle, and you're allowed then to give a second demonstration. And if they struggle in that and there's a marker there, then that's where their score is then noted, and it's cross-referred to the actual scoring sheet that's held within the manual. Next slide, please. The whip stitch and the cordovan, that's your next two stitches that, as you can see, they've got that sort of leather lacing. So the whip stitch is the one at the top there. Many people say it's like a blanket stitch. And it's slightly more demanding because there's a wee bit more working memory there, especially if that person has just finished doing a running stitch. They might want to continue doing a running stitch, and they might not be able to inhibit that, and they want to just continue doing a running stitch. So if they do that twice with your demonstrations, then that's a marker of what score they're at. There's also problem solving errors that you add. So once they've done the 3 stitches, you actually place 2 different errors and you ask them to fix it. And again, you're noting if they can do that. And at whichever point they struggle, then that's their marker of what score they come out as. Then if they have achieved that whip stitch, you go into the cordovan, the final stitch. Initially, you get them to just have a wee look at it, and you ask them if they want to try and have a go themselves. Some people miraculously might do that. They might just have that ability to really see it and have that working ability to sort out what it is that the stitch is about and do it. If they can't do it, then again, as with the other stitches, you're allowed to provide 2 demonstrations. Now with this stitch, it is very much a higher loading on the working memory. Each stitch does give you that pressure, and also you've got the leather lacing as well. So it's really adding the pressure for that person. And equally, their attention has had to be sustained throughout the other stitches as well. So the difficult stitch is very much at the end as well. So their attention might be starting to go at that point. Okay, so thank you. So coming on to this now, what we've got is we've got a couple of wee videos. Now we've got a range of videos, but we decided to show these to you, and that we feel the single cordovan is the most complex stitch to do. So what we've got is a demonstration of it being shown, and also a demonstration of it being implemented by someone successful. But I want you to take note that even though this person can actually succeed in doing it, many people would struggle at this point.
Can you all see this? Sorry to interrupt. Can you see this video? Has it come up yet?
No, I can't see it.
Yet, is it?
Let me see if I can.
Can you do it your side, David?
Yeah. Well, I say that.
Right.
Well, I'm just going to share my screen.
Yeah.
So that will just stop you else sharing. So.
Hey. There we go. So there should be verbal instruction with this.
There should be sound with it.
Oh, hang on, bear with me a second. Screen. Share sound. Sorry, everybody. There's an extra button to press.
Thanks, David.
Okay, so watch me.
Can you hear it now?
Bring the needle to the front of the leather and push the needle through the next hole from the front to the back. Don't pull the lace too tight because you've got to leave a loop in it. Bring the lace to the front of the leather, and this time what I want you to do is put the needle through the loop you have made. And as you go through the loop, keep the needle to the left of the lace. pull the lace through the loop, tighten the stitch by pulling the lace from the back, and then by pulling the long lace end, make sure the lace isn't twisted. So if you can do 3 stitches.
Now, before we go into the next video where the person actually implements that stitch, just want to make an observation and a point about, if you noted how complex it became providing that information to that person. You know, okay, they were getting the visual of what to do, but they were getting a lot of instruction as well. And cognitively, that can be quite an overload for a person with dementia. So, you know, it is a hard stitch to do. And as Charlie was saying in his presentation, you know, people need things broken down for a reason. And once they get to potentially Cordovan, even broken down slowly and in certain sections, it might just be too much for that person. And you may find they'll go on to do stitches that are very similar to what they've done previously. So it is a complex stitch for many people. But the person that we go on to show you now, this person can actually do it quite well, just to let you see how it is done.
Right, sharing it again. This is the next one.
Just the next one. There's no talking throughout this, so we don't have to worry about any sound. And as you can see, as a person's doing the stitch, it's very fiddly, because you're really having to keep the stitch straight, keep it from twisting, having to hold it to create that loop. All of these things really come about through initiation and working memory, really. Now, good learning for me, the therapist, with this actual part of the assessment is you'll notice that the lace is starting to get really quite small now, and the person is very lucky being able, they're talented enough to achieve the actual stitch with very little amount of lace left. But I would strongly advise that before you go into an assessment, just to make sure your lace is long enough, because you could get to that, or even take back a couple of stitches to ensure that you've got enough leather lacing, because that, you obviously don't want that to affect the ability of that person, should it be that they're able to achieve that stitch. But as you can see, there's a lot of fiddling having to go on to straighten it, to make it right. And the correcting that that person's doing here and making it correct and shiny and all straight and neat looking, that was also created as a task in the second stitch. So here we could see a note of all the things that pretty much that assessment asked for. Is that sustained attention, semantic memory for verbal instructions. There was a need for episodic memory from the demonstration. There was increased working memory for processing obviously the greater complexity of this stitch. There was more complex concept formation in order to understand how the stitch is formed. And initiation, flexibility and inhibition for forming this was more complex, because it might have been that they wanted to just do other stitches that they'd seen previously. And there's also an increased working memory from applying the plan while executing the practical stages. So that's just one of the stitches, and that's what we get, what we observe from just that one stitch. Now the score that we have can then be noted from our assessment. So next slide,
so please. I'm going to move on to, I'm going to share my screen now.
Yeah.
So I'll just go back to mine.
Thank you.
From current slide. There we go.
That's great, thanks, Ilse.
Is that okay? Yeah, so there's just an example of, would you want to speak about this slide, Jackie, or do you want me to?
Yeah, Yeah, that would be great actually, if I could just mention it, because these are things that we do come across. You know, when we do assessments, it looks really messy, but that's pretty much sometimes what we have, is that, you know, the running stitch there is taking visual cues from the whip stitch. The whip stitch lace is taken across the front and worked back from backwards. There's a real mix of things that can happen. So we really have to sit down and analyse it and have a wee look at it and think, right, what's this person done and where have they struggled and at what point?
Lost your sound there, Jackie. I think we've lost a connection.
Look like they're still there.
Yeah, I think their screen's frozen. I think they've lost connection.
No.
Yeah, it's okay. I can continue on till Jackie comes back.
Oh,
Yeah.
thanks, Elsa.
That's okay. So yeah, so just she was saying you know, it's showing you how the level of difficulty this person had, and ultimately ended up with a score of 3.4, which was quite low for this man. And this is an example of why we use the large leather screen. It is predominantly used for people that you know, have difficulty with hand dexterity or visual impairment, and for the elderly population. But we found that the Lackles is good for most of our service users, because you can see the difference in the size compared to the standard one. It's tiny, which would put a lot of people at a disadvantage already. And then again, for infection control measures, there are disposable cork Lackles, and also there's another, it's not a Claudia Allen one, but it is another organiser that's done the plastic version as well for infection control. But we still use the original Lackles, and we just make sure that we implement infection control measures with that, with, you know, antibacterial hand gel, washing hands, wiping down, letting them air dry, etc. So we've covered that one. And this is just showing you, it's just a ready reckoner that we've developed, and we've sat down closely with the mental health OTs to look at the different scores and how that correlates into stairlift use, because in the manuals there is nothing that specifically relates the Lackles to stairlift use, but there is a section that talks about using new equipment. So we felt that this worked really well with the stairlift. So what we did is we looked at how the different scores relate to stairlift use, and obviously the level of support that the person might require depending on what score they achieve. And again, it's not set in stone. This is just a ready reckoner, and it forms part of your wider assessment as well. But even at sort of score 4.4 to 4.6, the person still has a capacity to learn stairlift use with repetition and practice, and it's about embedding the use of allowing the person the rehabilitation approach to embed use of the stairlift into their procedural memory. And I've been so surprised about how many people that have installed stairlift for who I thought they're always going to need carer support, but a few days after they've started using it, they've become very adept. Even, you know, although they have cognitive challenges, which is quite interesting. So again, I know we're getting close to 5 o'clock. Is there any other questions that people have at this point? And then I'm just going to do a wee summary of what we've done with the reports and risk management, etc.
I can't see any hands up, and there aren't any questions in the chat that I can see.
Okay, that's great. I'll just keep carrying on because of time. Yeah. Yeah, but I mean, we've got an opportunity at the end if there's any questions. So this whole project involved service improvement for us as well, and we had to look at our assessment processes and our risk management processes as well, and also the templates that we use. So you'll all be familiar with risk management. The risk management forms are quite generic, quite standardised. You get different scores depending on the severity of the perceived risk and the outcome. But what we use in Fife is a risk management plan, which I'll show you in a second. We find it's more meaningful and informative, and it can be used as a document, a working document to use with individuals. We developed our in-house in-service training workshops to all of the council OTs as well, and we updated our process maps and our procedures in line with that, and it is now part and parcel of our stairlift assessment process to use standardised assessment tools where appropriate. So again, that's just a photograph showing you at a workshop that we delivered. We've also ran refresher workshops since the original workshops as well. And there's Charlie there just giving his part of the presentation. And again, and this is a sample risk management plan. So you may have something already in your service that you're using, but it's very much about, you know, we want to achieve safe stairlift use. We've identified what the risks are. And then also we need to put in what are the support actions, the control measures that we're putting in place, and then what are the contingency plans if after review the person is no longer independent using the stairlift, or even with support is no longer safe with the stairlift. So it's about having those conversations with the family and the person with dementia as early as possible about saying, right, we're going to put in this stairlift for you, but we'll be closely reviewing it, following it up. As soon as it's installed, we will also agree with you a timescale to review. It could be 3 weeks, it could be 3 months, it could be 6 months. You set the review. And then you go back, we have a specific review waiting list, and it's not just for people with dementia, it's for other areas that we need to review closely, and then we will pick them up and review them again. But it also gives the person and their family the responsibility as well. They sign up to this and agree to this plan, and then we update it as we keep reviewing. So we find this very useful. Just to briefly touch on some training and development opportunities that you should really consider. We would strongly encourage you to look at the Dementia Friends that you can go on and do self-taught training on. There's also the Dementia Informed and the Dementia Skilled training that you might be able to access in your region. I've just been through the Dementia Champions course myself, which was excellent, and you may again have something similar in your area. I would strongly encourage you to go through that if you have an interest in this area. And also connecting people, connecting support, that document I mentioned at the beginning early on. Do you have something that's an equivalent with, you know, Alzheimer's Society or Alzheimer's Scotland, etc.? And do you have partners that you work with closely, and allied health professions that you can work with closely? And also, Charlie presented there a bit about executive function. Is there any training that you can access on executive function in your area that would give you and your colleagues a fuller understanding of cognition? And then just briefly, I just want to touch on a wee case study. Now, this is Jenny. She's 94, and she had a lot of things going on in her life. She lived alone. She had a cognitive impairment. It was undiagnosed at the time. She had impaired vision. She was almost blind. She had, you know, impaired mobility because of her medical conditions. And she lived in a 2-storey house, and the toilet bathroom was upstairs with the bedroom. So you would, on the face of it, you'd think, this lady's not a great candidate for a stair lift. Now, this was early into her project, so my colleague and Charlie did a joint visit and carried out a mocha with her. She wasn't able to use a LACLs because of her visual impairment, but from the mocha they were able to create a cognitive profile of the lady, and they were able to see that she had adequate, reasonable working memory and executive function to be able to use a stair lift. So on the basis of the assessment, as well as a wider assessment, my colleague Elaine had assessed this lady functioning in her own environment quite independently. A stair lift was installed. And the stair lift was installed. It was reviewed immediately after it was installed, and there was repeated visits to make sure that Jenny was safe and confident and adept using the stair lift. And she managed to use the stair lift for about 1.5 years, but as her condition declined, she needed a care package, and the carer supported her with the stair lift. And eventually, because of her declining health, she had to be admitted into care, but it did enable Jenny to be able to live at home independently for that bit longer. And also, you know, for her quality of life and well-being, it was a great thing that she could stay at home, but also in terms of looking at cost benefit as well. You know, it delayed this lady going into care and expensive package and, you know, expensive care provider. So it's just a little example of the benefits of using cognitive screening. And we have many more examples since then of the benefits of this project. So just as a summary here, what have been the benefits? So it's enhanced our risk management processes, risk assessment. It supports discussion and advanced planning with service users and their families and caregivers. And basically, service users are receiving a high quality personalised assessment from us. Can lead to improved well-being. We don't want people to have to move out their home. That it can be a very traumatic experience for anyone, let alone someone with a cognitive impairment. And crucially, it's allowed us to work in close partnership with our NHS colleagues as well, and to adopt a standardised screening tools within our service. It's enhanced the way that we provide assessment and our clinical reasoning. Oh, it's popped up at the top here. Increased our skills, as I said, in our assessment processes, and again provided an evidence base for our assessment and our clinical reasoning. So there, at the end of the slides, there are just some references and recommended reading that you can look up, and Charlie's provided lots of references and evidencing of his executive function as well. There we go at the end. So thank you very much for being so attentive and using your attention very well. So has anybody got any other questions before we wrap up?
Well, we've got one clap. We've got a question from Di. On average, how long does it take to administer the mocker, and how long does it take to administer the Lackels?
Well, doing it in the home setting, I mean, they do say that the mocker or the mini ACE, if you want to use that, is 10-15 minutes. You wouldn't want to spend an awful lot of time labouring on these assessments, because if the person's labouring on one area, it shows that they're struggling, and then you just move on to the next section. But yeah, usually it's never usually as short as 10 minutes. I mean, I allow 15 to 20 minutes, but then you need time after the visit to analyse as well. Give yourself time to analyse the results as well. The Lackels, again, can take a bit longer than the mini ACE, but again, for me at home, it would be no more than 20 minutes to half an hour administering it with the person. But then again, you have to allow yourself time as soon as you can after the visit to analyse and interpret what's just happened. Jackie, I don't know if you want to add in anything more about the time that it takes.
Yeah, I think it just depends on the person, doesn't it? Really, just how complex they're finding it. Certainly with the Lackels, it could be as short as 10 minutes, or as long, like you say, as 20-25 minutes, depending on just how much they're struggling. Some people just might refuse to do it. But I think certainly the Lackels is more user-friendly than something like the ACE, which is quite scary. So I wouldn't try and do the two at the same time, because it could be a bit heavy duty for that person, isn't it?
Yeah, that's a good point, Jackie. Yeah, you don't want to overload the person and put them
true.
in an unfair position. Yeah.
Di also asks, is it something that you would go back and do after the initial visit or assessment?
Generally, yes. Generally, it might be that, I mean, I do keep a copy of the mini ACE in my work bag. So if it's appropriate, I may well do it on the initial assessment. There's nothing wrong with that if that seems and feels appropriate. But you do want to check in terms of, has one already been done? Because if one has been done recently with the person, then it kind of invalidates you doing one if the one has been done recently, because obviously they may remember some sections off the test. So I would usually not do it on the initial assessment. I would plan it to come back and do it. And obviously you want to make sure that you've got a quiet environment, and that you've got the setting right for the person. Try and get them seated at a table if you can. So you try and plan it.
Question from me. In terms of when you review somebody, how does it often happen that you have to remove a stairlift if you say reviewed after a year or maybe 2?
Yeah, it's a hard one to say how often, but no, actually. No, I mean, the great thing about this project is that we found that actually more and more people are benefiting from the stairlift rather than us coming out in 6 months and going, oh, I have to remove it. I think because you've got such a robust assessment process, you've already through your assessment realise the person's going to probably manage quite well with the stairlift or with support. So generally the person can have the stairlift for quite a long time. It's usually things like other factors such as a change in their health affects it, or a change in their situation affects it, or they may just well, their care needs have increased to the extent where they're no longer able to manage at home. But no, it's not, I wouldn't say it's often that we have to remove a stairlift, but because you've had that early discussion about we're going to keep reviewing this, and at some point we may decide it's no longer safe for you to use a stairlift, because we've had that early discussion, the person is aware that might be an eventuality, and we're already having that discussion about alternative living arrangements with the person as well, which is very helpful. Does that answer your question okay?
It does, thank you, Elsa. And another question from me. You know, when you prescribe, once you've done the assessment, either with the mocker or the Lackles, do you use that then to help you decide on sort of the type of functions that the stairlift has? So, for example, if somebody's got difficulty with transfers, sort of the difference between like the non-interlinked seat and the footplate, and manual versus powered footplate, and sort of manual versus powered swivel at the top, and various things, or if there's overruns and things.
Yes, you want to try and, if you can, keep the operations as simple as possible. But if they can't be avoided, you know, if just because of the stair design you have to go with a certain stairlift, we really need to take that into account and work with our stairlift provider on what types of options there are, you know, and you know, is there more than one option that we could look at here to keep the stairlift simple for the person? So very much so the stairlift model has to be taken into account as well.
Sorry, another question for me. Do you have
some stairlifts are quite complicated?
Yeah, some of the, and there are some features that are a bit odd, and especially the ones with the folding track at the bottom of the stairs, or if you've got, you know, you need to, or you've got a very odd stairs and you need to send it up to a charge point somewhere else. It's kind of some of those can be a bit awkward. Once a stairlift's gone in, for example, do you have a tech that would go out and sort of help familiarize that individual with the stairlift, so that when you go out to review it, that they've actually had a chance to practice with support from therapy?
It would be the responsibility of the occupational therapist. So initially the engineer will provide a demonstration, but what we try and do is we try and make sure our stairlift provider gives us as much notice as we can, so that we can plan the follow-up visit as soon as we can, post-installation, and the assessing OT would then follow that up with the follow-up visit. We try and avoid stairlift installations on a Friday for people that have a cognitive impairment, obviously, because we need to get out there. Or if we can't, we would get a colleague to do it, or we would make sure that family members were there to support the person until we can get out. Because we have had one instance where a lady had a severe injury from using a stairlift unsupervised. However, she didn't have a cognitive impairment, and it wasn't anticipated that she would have an injury. It was just, unfortunately, it was just a really, you know, a fluke incident that happened where she had used the stairlift inappropriately. So there's some things you just can't account for, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Does that answer your question? Okay.
It does. Thank you, Elsa. Has anybody else got any more questions? I can't see any hands popping up. It's very weird because you're asking questions and you can't see people's reactions, so it feels really disconcerting when it's just silence.
Yeah. Is there anything in the chat there at all? Have you looked at that?
Lots of thank yous. We've got Polly and Chris saying a very informative presentation, impressive for clinical reasoning and cognitive considerations during prescription. Everybody's saying thank you, excellent, very useful, and it's really sort of provoked some thoughts, and sort of hopefully will improve. You know, hopefully people can take away what you guys have done and actually implement some of it in their own.
Yeah, I mean, certainly across the UK, we've had a huge amount of interest in this, and many services since we started this have taken up a similar project and tried to work with their health and, you know, with their health partners to come up with a joint project. So yeah, it's definitely we could easily run a private business delivering training on this, you know.
But I think
it's such an untapped potential. It's also got a great potential for research as well. And I notice there's at least one student on today, So we're trying to
Yes.
encourage any students that are interested in this area to certainly get on board, because it's ripe for research. And certainly, as Charlie knows as well, like, you know, we've never really, nobody's actually ever, like the LACOS, for example, went into the LACOS tool into such a degree, into such a detail in terms of executive function and what's actually going on when you're doing the LACOS. So there's so much research can be done on that alone.
Well, I think it's a fantastic area of work, and given the fact that people are living longer, people are wanting to stay home longer, and you know, more and more people are developing cognitive impairments, and it's certainly something that we definitely need to actually think about and actually do, because as you say, it can have huge implications on somebody's quality of life, especially the lady in the example. You know, the sort of delayed entry into a placement for a year and a half. So I mean, that saves potentially, well, saves the client possibly tens of thousands, and saves the local authority possibly tens of thousands.
Yeah.
We've got a question from Di again. Have any of the Stairlift companies showed any interest in funding research?
Good question, but no. No, they haven't, interestingly enough, and I don't know why that is, because the housing OT conference we did a couple of years ago, pre-pandemic, was actually sponsored by Stana.
Yes, it was, yeah.
Yeah, so, but no, there hasn't been, but that, you're right, you know what, they should be, because it's going to benefit their company if they're designing stairlifts with for people with dementia in mind. It's got to be good for them as well. Yeah.
The audacious as we can ask them when we visit, and when we visit on visits and exhibitions. That's definitely true. Put them all on the spot. So we've had a message from Jacqueline and Charlie saying thank you for your kind comments, and don't hesitate to get in touch if you have any other questions through either email or Twitter. I just want to say again, Elsa, Jackie, Charlie, thank you very much for spending your valuable time with us this afternoon. I, for one thing, I've just moved out of practice into higher ed, but if I was still in practice, this is something that would be incredibly useful and something I intend to share with my students.
Absolute pleasure, and all the best for your delve into higher ed. All the best with that.
Yeah. Well, thanks very much, everybody. And our next webinar now will be in September. So I hope everybody enjoys the summer and gets a chance to have a good break and a little holiday, and see you all again soon.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, everybody. Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.